Before we begin, if you find value in exploring the untold and often difficult chapters of World War II history, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These stories matter, and your support helps us continue bringing them to light with the depth and respect they deserve. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy run red as Allied forces storm Fortress Europe. Canadian troops of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division push inland from Juno Beach, their boots sinking into French soil for the first time. The objective lies 12 miles south, the ancient city of Caen, a vital crossroads that British Field Marshal Montgomery insists must fall on D-Day itself. But between the advancing Canadians and that medieval skyline stands an enemy unlike any they have encountered before. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth. Boys turned into soldiers, fanaticism forged into flesh, trained to die rather than retreat. What unfolds in the hedgerows and villages north of Caen over the coming weeks becomes one of the most brutal and morally complex chapters of the entire Normandy campaign, a story that challenges our understanding of warfare, justice, and the terrible choices men make when civilization collapses around them. The Regina Rifle Regiment reaches the village of Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse by evening of D-Day. Soldiers dig in, exhausted, relieved to have survived the beaches, but there is no rest. On June 7th, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers push toward the villages of Orthy and Buren, approaching the Carpiquet airfield. Intelligence suggests light resistance. The reality proves catastrophically different. From concealed positions in the thick Norman bocage, those maze-like hedgerows that turn every field into a fortress, Panzerpfeffers and Panthers of the Hitlerjugend suddenly erupt. Machine gun fire rips through Canadian ranks. Mortar rounds shriek down. Young Canadian soldiers, many seeing combat for the first time, find themselves trapped in a killing ground. The German soldiers emerging from cover look disturbingly young, 16, 17, 18 years old. Children by any reasonable measure, yet fighting with a ferocity and tactical skill that shocks the Canadians. These are not ordinary conscripts. The Hitlerjugend Division, formed in 1943, represents the culmination of Nazi indoctrination. Recruited from the Hitler Youth movement, these teenagers have spent their entire adolescence immersed in National Socialist ideology, physical training, weapons drill, racial theory, absolute loyalty to the Führer. Their officers, mostly veterans from the Eastern Front, have molded them into true believers. They do not simply fight. They fight with the conviction that retreat equals betrayal, that capture equals dishonor, that death in service to the Reich represents the highest calling. The bocage itself becomes a character in this nightmare. Ancient hedgerows, some dating back to Roman times, rise 10 to 15 feet high, their roots sunk deep into earthen embankments. Visibility drops to meters. Every gap in the hedge could conceal a machine gun nest. Every bend in the sunken lanes could hide a panzer. The Canadians, trained for more open warfare, struggled to adapt. Meanwhile, the Hitlerjugend, defending their positions with intimate knowledge of the terrain, turned the landscape into a meat grinder. At Orthy and Buren, Canadian casualties mount horrifically. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders and Sherbrooke Fusiliers suffered devastating losses. Dozens of men are captured as German counterattacks overwhelm isolated Canadian positions. Then the rumors start, whispers passing from foxhole to foxhole. Some of the captured Canadians have not reached prisoner of war camps. Some have simply disappeared. On June 8th, as Canadian forces regroup and prepare for renewed assaults, intelligence officers begin hearing disturbing reports from French civilians. Executions, Canadian prisoners shot in cold blood. The reports seem too terrible to believe, yet too consistent to ignore. Several witnesses describe similar scenes, groups of Canadian soldiers, hands raised, being marched away by SS troops, then bursts of gunfire, then silence. The truth emerges in fragments over the following days. At the Abbaye d'Ardenne, a medieval monastery being used as headquarters by SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commander of the 25th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, Canadian prisoners have been murdered. The exact number remains disputed by historians to this day, but multiple witnesses and post-war investigations document at least 18 to 20 Canadian soldiers executed in the Abbey Garden and surrounding fields between June 7th and 8th. Shot in the back of the head, bodies left where they fell. Some sources suggest the total may be higher, perhaps as many as 37 Canadians killed in various locations around Orthy-Buren and the Abbey grounds during those first chaotic days. Kurt Meyer himself will later be tried for war crimes. His role remains controversial. Some evidence suggests he gave explicit orders to take no prisoners during the initial counterattack. Other testimony indicates individual junior officers and enlisted men acted on their own initiative, caught up in the frenzy of close combat. What cannot be disputed is that soldiers under Meyer's command committed murder. Canadian prisoners of war, protected under the Geneva Conventions, were executed without trial, without justification, in clear violation of international law. When word of the Abbaye massacres reaches Canadian frontline units, the reaction is visceral. Soldiers who moments before might have accepted enemy surrenders now face an impossible calculation. Can you trust a raised hand when your friends were shot with their hands raised? Regimental diaries and post-war interviews reveal a profound shift in attitude. The war in Normandy had already been brutal. Now it becomes something darker. Orders from higher command remain clear. Prisoners will be taken and protected according to military law. But in the hedgerows, where officers cannot see every encounter, where split-second decisions mean life or death, those orders become abstract. The immediate reality is that many Canadian soldiers simply stop taking chances. The fighting around Caen intensifies through mid-June. Villages with names most Canadians cannot pronounce become sites of apocalyptic violence. Le Mesnil-Patrie, Rots, Puteaux-en-Bessin, the Highland Light Infantry of Canada, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Canadian Scottish Regiment, all bloodied in desperate close-quarters combat. The Hitlerjugend defend every hedge, every farmhouse, every meter of ground with suicidal determination. Snipers pick off Canadian officers. Panzerfausts ambush advancing tanks. Infiltration attacks overrun Canadian positions at night. The casualty rates on both sides reach levels unseen in the West since the trenches of the First World War. Accounts from Canadian veterans, recorded decades later, describe encounters that haunt them still. A group of Hitlerjugend soldiers emerging from a barn, hands raised, white cloth waving. The Canadians hold fire, begin to approach. Then one of the Germans reaches for a concealed grenade. The explosion kills a Canadian corporal. The surviving Canadians cut down the Germans. Was this a planned ambush or a desperate last act by one fanatic? Impossible to know. The result is the same. Trust disintegrates. Other veterans describe surrenders that appear genuine, young Germans crying, begging for mercy, and Canadian soldiers who, remembering the Abbey, remembering their own friends executed, pull the trigger anyway. Some describe feeling sick afterward, knowing they crossed a line. Others describe feeling nothing at all, just numbness, the emotional shutdown necessary to continue functioning in hell. Canadian commanders face their own dilemmas. Brigadier General Harry Foster, commanding the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade, receives reports of incidents involving prisoners. Some reports remain vague, sanitized for the record. Others are more explicit. A lieutenant describes his platoon refusing to guard German prisoners, forcing them to dig their own graves before shooting them. A sergeant reports that his men have adopted an unofficial policy: no prisoners from SS units. Foster and other senior officers understand that allowing such behavior to spread could undermine military discipline entirely, could transform the Canadian Army into something unrecognizable. Investigations are promised. Courts-martial are threatened. Yet enforcing discipline in the chaos of the Normandy breakout proves nearly impossible. Who witnessed what? Which shootings occurred during active combat and which after surrender? The line blurs. The evidence evaporates in smoke and confusion. The role of leadership cannot be ignored. While some junior officers attempt to maintain standards, others tacitly encourage revenge. A company commander tells his men that Hitler-Jugend prisoners are not worth the risk of guarding. A sergeant major looks the other way when wounded Germans are left untreated. These are not official policies. No written order survives directing the execution of prisoners. But in an environment where everyone knows comrades have been murdered, where the enemy consists of teenagers indoctrinated to view surrender as betrayal, where every hedge could hide an ambush, informal codes develop. Codes that exist in the space between military law and combat reality. German survivors of the Normandy battles, interviewed after the war, present their own perspective. Many Hitler-Jugend veterans insist they never engaged in false surrenders, never used white flags as ruses. They describe their own terror, facing veteran Canadian troops, their desperation as ammunition ran low, their confusion when attempts to surrender were met with gunfire. Some admit witnessing Canadian prisoners being shot, but blame individual soldiers or the fog of war rather than systematic policy. Others acknowledge the fanaticism of their training, but insist that by mid-June, as casualties mounted and the hopelessness of their position became clear, most simply wanted to survive. The youngest, those 15 and 16-year-olds conscripted in the division's final days, describe being thrown into combat with minimal training, told to hold impossible positions, abandoned by retreating officers. The tactical situation around Caen remains deadlocked through June. Operation Epsom, the British attempt to encircle Caen from the west, achieves limited gains at enormous cost. The Hitler-Jugend, reinforced by other SS divisions, holds firm. The city itself becomes a medieval ruin under Allied bombing. Norman civilians caught between the armies suffer terribly. Canadian soldiers pushing through shattered villages encounter scenes of devastation that rival anything from the Eastern Front. Bodies in rubble, livestock rotting in fields, the stench of death omnipresent. In this landscape of collapse, moral certainties crumble. The rules of civilized warfare, debated in conference rooms in London and Washington, seem laughably irrelevant in the smoking wreckage of Carpiquet. July arrives. The Canadians continue grinding forward. Operation Charnwood finally takes most of Caen on July 9th, though the Hitler-Jugend withdraw in good order to new defensive positions. The price is staggering. Canadian casualties since D-Day exceed 5,000 killed and wounded. The Hitler-Jugend division, once numbering over 20,000, has been reduced to a fraction of its strength, yet the survivors fight on with undiminished ferocity. The breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, and the subsequent pursuit across France still lies weeks away. Every day brings new horrors, new choices, new failures of humanity. Canadian military police do conduct some investigations into alleged prisoner killings. Reports reach the Judge Advocate General's office. Witness statements are collected, but prosecutions prove rare and convictions rarer still. The evidentiary challenges are immense. Identifying specific individuals responsible for specific acts in the chaos of combat approaches impossibility. Moreover, military authorities understand that pursuing such cases too aggressively could demoralize troops still fighting, could suggest moral equivalence between Allied soldiers defending civilization and SS war criminals. The decision is made, largely implicitly, to let most incidents go uninvestigated. Justice, such as it exists, will be reserved for the most egregious cases, those with clear evidence and multiple witnesses. The German side faces different accountability. After the war, Kurt Meyer stands trial for the Abbaye d'Ardenne massacres. The proceedings, held by a Canadian military court in December 1945, attract international attention. Meyer's defense argues that he never ordered prisoners executed. that any killings resulted from unauthorized actions by subordinates in the heat of battle. Prosecutors present testimony from French civilians who witnessed executions and from Canadian soldiers who survived by pretending to be dead among the corpses. The court convicts Meyer of responsibility for the deaths and sentences him to death by firing squad. However, the sentence is later commuted to life imprisonment amid controversy over whether Canadian forces had themselves committed similar acts, whether prosecuting Meyer for his subordinates' actions set a dangerous precedent. Meyer serves 9 years before release in 1954. Other Hitlerjugend officers implicated in prisoner killings escape prosecution entirely, hidden in the chaos of post-war Germany or protected by Cold War politics. The historiographical debate continues to this day. Canadian military historian Terry Kopp notes that while incidents of Canadian soldiers shooting prisoners almost certainly occurred, the scale and systematic nature remain difficult to establish. British historian Max Hastings argues that both sides in Normandy committed atrocities, though the German violations occurred earlier and more extensively. German historians, particularly those examining the Waffen-SS, acknowledge the Abbaye massacres, but caution against assuming all Hitlerjugend personnel participated in or approved of war crimes. The challenge for historians lies in separating documented facts from rumors, wartime propaganda, and post-war myth-making. We know Canadian prisoners were murdered. We have credible reports that some Canadians shot surrendering Germans. We cannot know with certainty how many incidents occurred, how many were justified in the moment as combat actions versus cold-blooded executions, how many resulted from explicit orders versus individual decisions. What we can say with confidence is that the Normandy campaign exposed the fragility of military discipline under extreme conditions. The laws of war, codified in the Geneva Conventions, depend on a degree of order and mutual restraint that vanishes when combat becomes existential. Canadian soldiers facing the Hitlerjugend confronted an enemy that defied their expectations. These were not weary Wehrmacht conscripts looking for an excuse to surrender. These were ideologically committed teenagers who fought with terrifying effectiveness and, in some documented cases, violated the laws of war themselves. The Canadian response, whether individual acts of revenge or tacit institutional tolerance of prisoner killings, represented a moral failure. But understanding why that failure occurred requires grappling with the context, the horror of discovering murdered comrades, the terror of combat in the bocage, the exhaustion and trauma accumulating day after day. Veterans who fought in Normandy carry these memories to their graves. Some speak openly in later years about what they witnessed, what they did, expressing regret or attempting to explain the inexplicable. Others take their secrets with them, unable or unwilling to revisit those days. Regimental reunions become spaces of shared trauma, where men who lived through hell can acknowledge its reality without judgment. But even among veterans, consensus on what happened and why remains elusive. Some insist the Hitlerjugend deserved no mercy given their own crimes. Others argue that every failure to uphold the laws of war, regardless of provocation, diminishes the Allied cause. Most occupy a conflicted middle ground, recognizing that war creates situations where good people do terrible things, and that judging those actions from the safety of peacetime requires humility. The strategic aftermath of the Normandy campaign ultimately vindicates the Allied cause. The liberation of France proceeds, the Nazi regime collapses, the concentration camps are discovered, revealing horrors that dwarf the battlefield atrocities. In the grand narrative of World War II, the incidents involving Canadian soldiers and Hitlerjugend prisoners become footnotes, uncomfortable details that complicate the clean story of good versus evil. Yet those footnotes matter. They remind us that war corrupts even just causes, that the distinction between soldier and war criminal can blur in the crucible of combat. that vengeance and justice are not synonyms. Modern military training incorporates lessons from Normandy. The Canadian Armed Forces, like other NATO militaries, emphasize the laws of armed conflict, the absolute requirement to treat prisoners humanely regardless of circumstances. Rules of engagement are drilled relentlessly. Officers understand their responsibility to prevent and punish war crimes. Yet military historians and ethicists acknowledge that training can only do so much. Place soldiers in situations of extreme danger, expose them to trauma and loss, confront them with enemies who violate norms, and the risk of moral breakdown persists. The challenge for military institutions is not to pretend their personnel are immune to such pressures, but to create systems of accountability that function even in chaos, to cultivate a professional ethos strong enough to withstand the worst provocations. The Hitlerjugend Division's fate serves as its own cautionary tale. By August 1944, the division has been virtually destroyed. Most of its original personnel are dead or captured. Survivors are absorbed into other units or simply disappear. The Nazi regime, desperate for manpower, continues drafting children into the final months of the war, creating new Hitlerjugend units that fight with equal fanaticism and equal futility in the defense of Germany itself. These boys, born in the late 1920s and early 1930s, represent a generation sacrificed on the altar of totalitarian ideology. Many are killed in the final apocalyptic battles. Others survive to face a shattered nation and the burden of complicity, however young and indoctrinated in monstrous crimes. French civilians who witness the battles around Caen carry their own traumas. Villages are obliterated. Families are killed in crossfire or by bombing. Fields are sown with mines and corpses. The liberation brings relief, but also profound grief. Some French witnesses to the prisoner executions, both German crimes against Canadians and alleged Canadian crimes against Germans, provide testimony to investigators. Their accounts, filtered through language barriers and the chaos of occupation, add pieces to the historical puzzle, but rarely definitive answers. France's own reckoning with collaboration and resistance, with its own moral complexities during the occupation, colors how these witnesses remember and report what they saw. The bocage itself, that ancient landscape that shaped the battle, returns to agricultural use. Farmers plough fields where thousands died. Hedgerows concealing mass graves are cleared. The physical scars fade, though even today, 75 years after the battle, unexploded ordnance is occasionally uncovered. Memorials dot the Normandy countryside, honoring Canadian dead, acknowledging French civilian losses, sometimes noting German casualties. These memorials rarely mention the darker episodes, the prisoner shootings, the breakdown of restraint. Memory, both collective and individual, prefers heroism and sacrifice to moral ambiguity and failure. Canadian war cemeteries in Normandy hold thousands of graves. Bretteville-sur-Lez, Canadian War Cemetery. Benny-sur-Mer, Canadian War Cemetery. Row upon row of white headstones, marking young men who never came home. Among them are almost certainly soldiers who themselves committed acts they would not want remembered, alongside countless others who maintained their humanity under unimaginable pressure. The cemeteries make no distinction, all are honored equally. This is perhaps appropriate. The individuals buried there were products of their circumstances, asked to do an impossible job under impossible conditions. They deserve remembrance not as plaster saints, but as flawed human beings who did their best in hell. The question of moral equivalence inevitably arises. Were Canadian soldiers who shot Hitlerjugend prisoners morally equivalent to SS troops who executed Canadian prisoners at the Abbaye d'Ardennes? Most historians reject this equivalence, while acknowledging both as violations of the laws of war. The Abbaye massacres occurred early in the campaign, before significant provocation, as part of a broader SS culture of brutality developed on the Eastern Front. They appear to have involved explicit decisions by leadership to murder prisoners systematically. The alleged Canadian shootings, by contrast, occurred in a context of extreme combat stress, often in ambiguous circumstances, without apparent systematic orders from command. Intent matters. Context matters. The Canadian military institution attempted, however imperfectly, to maintain standards. The SS, by design and doctrine, rejected those standards. This does not excuse individual Canadian soldiers who murdered prisoners. It does suggest different levels of institutional and moral culpability. The debate over false surrenders deserves particular attention. Multiple Canadian accounts describe Hitlerjugend soldiers pretending to surrender, then attacking when Canadians approached. German veterans largely deny this occurred as a tactic, though some admit individual desperate acts. The evidentiary record is maddeningly unclear. Some incidents may have been genuine false surrenders. Others may have been misunderstandings, language barriers causing German surrender attempts to appear threatening, or isolated Germans changing their minds at the last moment. Still others may have been fabrications, Canadian soldiers post hoc justifying shootings by claiming the Germans were not really surrendering. In the absence of clear evidence, historians can only note the allegations, acknowledge the plausibility of at least some incidents, given the fanaticism of Hitlerjugend indoctrination, and recognize that such allegations, true or not, profoundly affected Canadian behavior. The role of age in this story cannot be overstated. The Hitlerjugend division's recruitment of teenagers, some as young as 15, represents a particular Nazi crime. These children were not adults making informed decisions to commit war crimes. They were victims of indoctrination, manipulated by a regime that viewed them as expendable. Canadian soldiers found themselves in the morally disorienting position of fighting children. Some accounts describe Canadians shocked at the youth of German dead, only to remember that those same teenagers had killed their friends moments before. How do you reconcile seeing a 16-year-old enemy soldier as simultaneously victim and perpetrator? Most Canadian soldiers seem to have resolved this by simply not thinking about it, by focusing on immediate survival, by dehumanizing the enemy sufficiently to function. The psychological cost of such compartmentalization only emerged years later. Post-traumatic stress, though not yet named or understood, afflicted many Normandy veterans. Nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt, moral injury. The latter concept, moral injury, has only recently gained recognition in psychiatric and military communities. It describes the psychological damage resulting from actions that violate one's moral code, or from witnessing others violate that code. Soldiers who killed prisoners or witnessed such killings often suffered not just from the trauma of combat generally, but from the specific wound of moral transgression. Veterans' hospitals in Canada treated thousands of Normandy survivors for what was then called battle fatigue or shell shock. How many suffered specifically from moral injury related to prisoner incidents? The records rarely specify, but anecdotal evidence suggests the number was significant. Reconciliation efforts between Canadian veterans and German veterans began decades after the war. Former enemies met at Normandy battlefields, sometimes tearfully embracing, acknowledging shared humanity. These meetings typically avoided discussing atrocities directly. The focus remained on mutual respect, on honoring the dead, on affirming that future generations must never repeat such horrors. Only occasionally did conversations turn to the darker episodes. A Canadian veteran might confront a former Hitlerjugend member about the Abbaye. A German might ask if Canadians also committed crimes. These conversations, when they occurred, rarely brought closure. Too much time had passed. Memories had faded or been reshaped. The truth remained contested, but the willingness to engage in dialogue represented a form of healing, an acknowledgement that moral complexity existed on all sides. The Holocaust's revelation at war's end profoundly affected how both participants and historians viewed the Normandy campaign. The discovery of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Treblinka placed individual battlefield atrocities in grim perspective. Whatever crimes Canadian soldiers committed paled beside industrial genocide. This created a moral hierarchy that many found troubling. Does fighting a genocidal regime excuse lesser crimes? Most ethical frameworks say no. Evil does not justify evil in response. Yet the Holocaust's enormity made prosecuting or even discussing Allied war crimes seem almost trivial by comparison. This tension persists in historical writing about the war. Historians struggle to condemn Allied violations without appearing to engage in false equivalence, to acknowledge moral failures without undermining the essential justice of the Allied cause. The Nuremberg trials established precedents for accountability that theoretically applied to all combatants. Superior orders provided no defense for war crimes. Soldiers had an obligation to refuse illegal orders. Command responsibility meant leaders could be held accountable for subordinates' crimes. These principles, formally articulated at Nuremberg, had existed in military law for decades, yet their application remained selective. German leaders and some Japanese leaders faced prosecution. Allied commanders did not, even when evidence suggested their forces had committed violations. The reason was partly practical, victor's justice, and partly principled, a judgment that Allied violations, however regrettable, did not approach the systematic criminality of Axis forces. This double standard, legally defensible or not, shaped post-war memory and continues to complicate discussions of wartime morality. Canadian military leadership eventually acknowledged, in carefully worded official histories, that discipline problems existed during the Normandy campaign. These histories note cases of looting, unauthorized shootings, and other violations without providing specifics that might identify individuals or units. The tone is regretful but defensive, emphasizing the extreme stress of combat and the overall professionalism of Canadian forces. This institutional response reflects the tension between accountability and cohesion, between honest reckoning and protecting the reputation of the military and nation. More recent scholarship has pushed for greater transparency, arguing that acknowledging past failures strengthens rather than weakens military institutions. The Canadian Armed Forces, to its credit, has largely embraced this approach, using historical examples including Normandy to teach contemporary ethics and leadership. The media's role in shaping public understanding of these events evolved over decades. During the war, censorship prevented reporting of atrocities by any side. Newspapers celebrated Canadian heroism without nuance. After the war, initial histories maintained this triumphal narrative. Only in the 1970s and 80s did revisionist historians begin examining uncomfortable questions, often drawing on newly released archival documents and aging veterans' willingness to speak more frankly. Mainstream Canadian consciousness of the Abbé Dardenne massacres grew through books and documentaries. Awareness of potential Canadian crimes remained more limited, partly due to less definitive evidence and partly due to continued reluctance to tarnish national heroes. Current digital media allows broader discussion but also risks sensationalizing or distorting the historical record. What lessons can be drawn from this dark chapter? First, that moral clarity in war is illusory. Even just wars involve choices that haunt participants. Second, that institutional structures and leadership matter immensely. Militaries that emphasize the laws of armed conflict and hold personnel accountable, however imperfectly, are less likely to descend into systematic atrocity. Third, that understanding historical actors requires empathy without excusing them. Canadian soldiers in Normandy faced genuine dilemmas. Acknowledging those dilemmas does not justify murder, but does complicate simplistic condemnation. Fourth, that memory and history diverge. How nations remember wars reflects present values as much as past realities. Being honest about moral failures need not diminish appreciation for sacrifice and courage. The Normandy invasion remains a pivotal moment in history, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Canadian contribution, including the bloody battles around Caen, deserves honor and remembrance. But that remembrance must be complete, acknowledging not just valor but also the moral costs of warfare. The young men who stormed Juno Beach were heroes. Some of those same men, weeks later, may have committed acts they deeply regretted. Both realities coexist. Pretending otherwise disrespects their full humanity and obscures lessons critical for future generations. The story of Canadian soldiers and the Hitlerjugend in Normandy offers no easy conclusions. It presents us with a mirror, reflecting the darkest potentials of human nature alongside glimmers of decency and restraint. It asks uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the price of victory. Most importantly, it reminds us that the line dividing good and evil runs through every human heart, that circumstances can move anyone closer to crossing that line, and that constant vigilance, both institutional and individual, remains necessary to prevent the descent into barbarity. The hedgerows of Normandy, stained with blood from all sides, stand as testament to these truths. We honor those who fought there, not by sanitizing their experiences, but by wrestling honestly with the full complexity of what they endured and what they did. If this exploration of one of World War II's most morally complex chapters has given you new perspective, please consider subscribing. History is not just about celebrating victories, but understanding the full human cost of conflict, including the moral injuries that outlast any battlefield. By engaging with these difficult stories, we ensure they inform our present and guide our future. Thank you for watching. And remember that the lessons of the past only matter if we are brave enough to learn them.